You can all hear me okay? Yeah, good. Right, well, very warm welcome to all of you. You can see the numbers still going up slightly to this joint IED and Arup webinar for this afternoon. I should apologise at the very outset that any of you who were clever enough to join very early may have heard some of our administrative preambles on the call due to a few IT issues, so apologies if you were party to any of that, but we'll make a start proper now. So very pleased to be here today. My name's Tom Stannard. I'm chair of the IED. I'm also day job wise chief exec at Salford City Council in Greater Manchester. I'm really pleased as the IED to be joined by one of our major partners, which is Arup, by both Jane and Zach, who you can see on the panelists list here, who are going to help to guide us through this afternoon's Delivering in Uncertain Times webinar. Also really pleased to be joined by Nigel Wilcock, who's our exec director here at the IED, who's also going to help to put some awkward questions and hopefully constructive, pardon the pun, questions to all of us as part of the panel here this afternoon. So very warm welcome to all of you. I'm hoping as well as the four of us, I'm looking at a list of 35 members of the IED. In the unlikely event any of you are not yet members, please do hang around after us, visit our website, ied.co.uk, for more information on how to join, or drop myself and Nigel a line, plug over, but we're here to also help with membership inquiries if that's of interest to any of you. So on to the event proper. We're here to talk about the uncertainty that affects the whole of the built environment and economic development regeneration industry at the moment, really. I'm particularly pleased we've been able to work with Arup on a recent survey across a number of professions involved in and around those worlds with us here in the IED, particularly to better understand impacts of inflation, cost inflation, and the effect that's having on supply chains, and consequentially through the project's pipeline. That is absolutely an issue for myself sitting in my day job in Greater Manchester. It's an issue for us across the sub-region, and I think when you put the inflation impacts alongside some of the issues we have collectively lobbied on, I think, for some time, particularly around the micro competitions for capital funding, it adds a general sense of inflation combined with financial uncertainty through those supply chains, which is clearly having a delivery impact. But we're also here this afternoon as well as exploring some of that research, ably assisted by Zach and Jane's contributions, to try and talk a bit about what we can do about those factors and about solutions. And I think this is not an event really for the faint-hearted in that respect. It's not only about bemoaning some of the delivery challenges we face, but also about exploring across the profession some of those collective solutions that we can work on. So I hope it's a useful, productive discussion in that respect. I think we have a sense, Nigel, of some of the topics that may come up as questions, but we're hoping this can be as interactive as possible as well. So please do use the usual hands and chat and so on functions if you can find them on your screens and participate at your will to think of some questions as Zach runs through a bit of a preamble presentation on this in just a moment, and fire those across. So without further ado, I'll pass across to Zach Wilcox from Arup to lead us through some preliminaries on this topic and give us a bit of a digest of what came back through the survey. And following on from that, I'll then ask Nigel to perhaps preside over the Q&A part, which all of us will participate in with your contributions. So thanks very much, and hope you enjoy the rest of the event. Zach.
Thank you very much, Tom. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Good. Well, thank you all for attending today. As Tom said, I'm going to give a bit of a presentation, but I really want this to start a dialogue for the rest of this session. This has been a labor of love, this bit of research with IED, because it's something that we really care about. We see the challenges that our partners across the sector are facing in trying to deliver meaningful projects that can deliver regeneration and economic development. And we see the challenges that we're facing due to the wider economic climate. So we wanted to understand what are the solutions that others are coming up with? How can we share those more broadly? And how can we start to make sense of things? So hopefully I can give us some answers to that today, but we can also start to share those a bit more broadly as well. I'm going to share my screen now. Great. As I said, I'm here to talk to you about some research we've been doing around delivering in uncertain times. I'm going to first share some of our kind of learning about inflation impacts in real time, how we've gone about the research. Then I'm going to talk about inflation impacts and how they're affecting delivery of local projects, then kind of split that up by project type so we get a bit more nuance and understanding, then sharing some learnings around how the sector is managing the impacts and some lessons for leading and engaging going forward. So first, kind of learning about inflation impacts in real time, as we've all been doing. First off to say, yes, we did a survey with the IED. The survey took place over the autumn last year, so 2022, asking people in the economic development field to reflect on how inflation and supply chain disruption have affected their projects over the past year, which is when things really start to begin to be felt from those impacts. I'm going to be upfront. Our response rate was relatively low. We had about 20 responses, which is helpful and fruitful, but we wanted to bring a bit more insight to the conversation. So we have conducted interviews with colleagues in the IED, as well as taken learnings from our own projects that we're doing in Arup, listening to our clients, listening to our partners in delivery to understand some insights from them. So what you're going to see today is a combination of findings from that survey, as well as broader lessons learned in relation to the survey, with thanks to the IED and colleagues across the company. And this is just a bit of context. You know, we were asking these questions and talking about the challenges of inflation when actually some of the cost increases were at their peak. So towards the end of last year, we saw that material cost inflation was at its highest, and this is data from BCIS, and labor costs had been high and were projected to continue to grow. We know that we're going to start to see some leveling off soon, which is brilliant, but it's just to say that the issues have been felt across us all and have felt particularly acute over the past year. And we've been listening to the market quite a bit. So I use the term quadruple whammy instead of triple whammy. I think that there's kind of four core issues happening here. We have inflation as we know it, which has been intrinsically tied to supply chain disruption, and then has had the follow-on challenges of pressures on finances that we've seen with interest rate rises. But then there's this fourth element of institutional knowledge and capacity to deal with all of these issues, which I will go into in a bit more detail. But this is inflation like we haven't seen in 3 decades. So the institutional knowledge and capacity to deal with some of these issues has felt particularly acute when compounded with those wider market pressures. So what does that mean for delivery of local projects? I'm not going to read the question on every slide. I'll leave it to you to read while I talk. But this is just to say, we asked members, you know, how affected have you been? The moral of the story is more than half of respondents have been extremely or very affected by all 3 issues: finance, supply chain, and inflation. And very few people have said that they haven't been affected by at all. So this is something that is hitting almost everywhere to some degree, and many of us quite acutely. And then in thinking about how big delays and cancellations that we're seeing from projects, the majority of respondents said that up to 40% of their capital expenditure have been canceled or delayed due to inflation and supply chain disruption. Some a bit less, some a little bit more. But in engaging with some of our clients and colleagues, we're seeing that anywhere in that 20 to 40% range is a common reflection of delayed or canceled capital spend last year. And then in understanding how much decision makers understand these impacts and what that means, overall, we know that most decision makers in our organizations are very aware and understand the impacts of inflation and supply chain disruption and finance issues on the operations of projects. We have leaders who are capable of making sense of the issues with systems in place to understand the impacts on their projects. But there are still gaps in understanding the full impacts and then also what to do about them, which is a slightly different picture. Again, in our research, we wanted to understand what are the risks that we're seeing. If we understand that everyone's been affected to some degree, and we have a good understanding around how supply chain disruption and inflation are affecting our projects, what are the risks that we see? By and far, the largest that we've heard from the survey and from engagement has been around affordability. And that's not just around affordability of new projects, but also the affordability of existing assets and their operations and maintenance being some of the top concerns. Of course, being financial issues, that would be the case. But I think some of the following answers are also incredibly important. Reputational risk is something that came up quite a lot. Reputational risk not in just failure to deliver, but especially if you have engaged with local communities or undertaken co-design on projects, not delivering or adjusting outcomes without re-engaging communities can really lead to high challenges with reputational risk for future engagement. There's also risks around need for redesign and whether or not that will meet all of the needs and the benefits that were stated maybe in original business cases, meeting wider targets, be they in business cases or in monitoring and evaluation, or the strategies that you have in place, as well as risks around the skills and capacity available to manage some of these problems and challenges that we're being presented with. So in summary, the impact that we're seeing in local government growth programs, in particular in local regeneration programs, is upwards of 40% of capital investment projects put on hold or canceled in the past year, creating risk to delivery, creating reputational risk, and also creating financial risk, which is a lot to manage for a sector, especially one that is constrained with resources, both in people and financially. So what does that start to look like when we think about the different types of projects that we undertake as a sector? We asked the same question 3 times, and that question was, what types of projects in the area, so be it town, city, or local authority or LEP area you work with, are seeing delays or cancellations from cost inflation? This first question actually was, what types of projects in your area you work with the most are being prioritized and maintained? So here you can see social housing, property and community infrastructure, and transport were among the highest as being stated as being prioritized and maintained throughout the cost inflation pressures that we're seeing today, whereas parks and public realm, climate change and net zero, and digital infrastructure were lower on the list. These are all relative, so I've just tried to get you to focus on the order. So first, we're talking about what's being prioritized and maintained. But then we asked, which of those sectors are seeing the greatest cost pressures? And again, it's those top 3 that are being prioritized and maintained that are also seeing the greatest cost pressures from inflation and supply chain disruption. And then lastly, when you look at of those projects or of those types of projects, which ones are experiencing the greatest delays and cancellations? Again, it's those top 3. So what we're seeing is even while some of our project areas such as social housing, property and community infrastructure, and transport are on the top of our list to prioritize and maintain, they are also facing the greatest cost pressures and then are subject to delays and cancellations the greatest. I think climate change and net zero is a really interesting one here, whereas while it wasn't high on the list for prioritization and maintenance, it was also lower on the list for cost pressures and delays, which might mean that it's so well integrated into some of our ways of working, some of our policies and strategies and procurement, that it might have been protected. Though this is a very mixed picture that I hope will come up a bit more in our conversation. Now, thinking about how we start to manage the impacts of cost inflation, there are a lot of options. I've put 8 on here. These are the 8 that I've heard the most, again, through our survey and through our engagement. Oftentimes reducing costs, either through design and scope, often called value engineering, is one of the key routes, though you also see rephasing and delaying projects. You see seeking additional funding or financing, reducing sustainability or net zero requirements or social value requirements, changing procurement requirements, and then also canceling projects. Another one that's also come up quite a bit is factoring in more contingency and inflation. And I think we started to see more of that as we started to understand the longevity of inflation that we're going to see, and as we started to understand the impact that it was having on our projects. And there's a temporal element that I'll touch on this a bit more. So first, I want to say that there's a wide range of responses around adaptation. Don't concentrate too much on the numbers here. I would like to, like you to think more about that. There's a scale across all of this. There's a wide variety of ways that we're dealing with this, and some of it is around reducing project costs through changes to design or scope. Again, that's that value engineering, or hopefully a better way of value engineering. We're also seeing a lot of rephasing or delaying projects, just a bit of wait and see. We also have seen across the sector seeking additional funding or financing for projects, as well as canceling projects, and then also reducing sustainability or social value requirements. So there's a wide range of tools that are being deployed. And then it's the same is true for supply chain disruption. We've seen a lot of renegotiating or negotiating with contractors, adjusting the project scope or design, and again, delaying or pausing the project where possible. Changing materials that are used, so that could be the finishes and the quality, as well as using project management tools to manage disruptions. I think the industry here is using a wide range of solutions to manage supply chain disruption, and renegotiating contracts and adjusting design and scope and delaying projects are some of the top actions that are being taken. There is a lag. We are just now starting to see some contractors going into administration as they reach a point where they may need to raise finance and restructure to deliver. So the relationship between risk sharing and delivery between our projects and some of our contractors is going to be incredibly important in the coming months as we continue. And then in thinking about how have we as a sector adjusted, learning and gaining information and insights has been incredibly important for how we adjust to adjust our delivery. By and large, we have been using a lot of in-house support. So calling on our in-house leadership team, our finance teams, and our program management teams has been incredibly important for how we manage these issues, but also reaching out to private sector partners, in particular in areas where we might not have a strong skill set, where it might be niche requirements for refinancing, for reapproaching procurement and contracts, or for redesign. One of the lowest levels of engagement that we've heard about, both through the survey and through our discussions, has been reaching out to other government partners. And that might be Whitehall in particular, but also some of our local authority partners to understand how they're managing some of these issues or what insights and advice they can offer. And that's something that we would like to talk about a bit more in our discussions. And thinking about how our local teams are employing their skills, there's a wide range that the sector has adapted positively to manage cost inflation. This can be quite a positive story. It doesn't all have to be a challenge. Necessity can be the mother of invention. By and large, we have heard a lot of great work that's being done to increase the skills and ways of working around risk management, financial management, and leadership skills to get us through some of these challenges. We've seen investment in relationships to deliver, so funders, financiers, and investors, as well as specialist consultants, so building longer term relationships to support delivery. And lastly, public engagement. Public engagement consultation was probably one of the lower responses that we received in both the survey and through our engagement. But we recognize how critical it is, especially again, if you have engaged in co-design and brought your constituents or your local communities on the journey with you on projects, making sure that they're kept abreast of the changes as they're happening, and that they know what to expect as the project evolves. Is incredibly important, but gaining those skills to do so appropriately and to do that well has been important. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch on some broader lessons for leading and engaging during uncertain times. And hopefully this leads us into some of the key issues that we want to talk about in our discussion. So firstly, some of these lessons are actually taken from some work that we did on the Towns Fund delivery partner over the past 2 years. And that was Arup among a consortium of partners working with 101 towns to deliver the Towns Fund and technical assistance to support that. And as we began to realize the challenges that cost inflation were going to have, we spoke with towns and we spoke with experts, and we came up with 4 key pieces of advice as you're working through some of these challenges. One is to take a step back and really understand your position in changing context. The world is changing really rapidly, and understanding how your project might fit within that changing context is really important. So not necessarily always referring back to plan A, but understanding how you might be fitting in with plan B or plan C. Second is around being really clear about what your assumptions are about how the world has changed since your original plan and how you think it will continue to change. Those assumptions are going to be really important, not just for taking decisions, but also for engaging the private sector, for engaging other partners so that they understand what assumptions you've made and are clear. The next is around agree your risk appetite. It might have changed. You might be willing to take on additional risk if the strategic or economic case for your project is even stronger now. And then lastly, it's about finding new ways of working with your stakeholders. Participative design and engagement are much harder now since you might have changed. So we need to make sure that we don't lose that trust that we've worked hard to build up. Those who might have heard me before, that sounds really grand. It's not like I do that much speaking, but I've been talking about this idea of FOMO in our sector for quite a while now. And for those who don't know, it's fear of missing out. And I think during the pandemic, we saw a lot of FOMO, and there were 2 types. To me, there's bad FOMO, which is you look around at everything that's changing in the world and you're kind of paralyzed by change. You think there's so many things going on. I need to research this and I need to do that. And you're spread too thin, or maybe you're too risk averse, or maybe you just want to wait everything out and then nothing happens. And you've gone through this big period of change and your projects and your strategy hasn't evolved with it. But then I also think that there's good FOMO, where you look around at everything that's happening in the world and you go, oh my God, there's all these opportunities. There's all these new ways of thinking and working and all of these things that we can try. So I'm going to take a really strategic and focused view around the 1, 2, or 3 things that I can really affect during this time of change. And I'm just going to try it out. Otherwise, I'm going to miss out on a really big opportunity. So I think a question that we need to keep asking ourselves, are we in the good FOMO or are we in the bad FOMO in our projects? And my last kind of parting thoughts before I open it up to discussion is what next? I think risk in not knowing how to do things can help you really reassess new ways forward. I do think that we are seeing a lot of invention and change in ways of working within the sector, and that is being driven by necessity, and that's exciting. I think we need to use our networks of very clever colleagues who are facing similar challenges, lean on them a bit more and learn from them. I think we need to consider the wide range of tools that we have to respond and choose the right fit for us. So after we've assessed where we are in this changing world, what is the right tool to fit our needs? And then lastly, be open and proactive around sharing insights and lessons learned and new ideas, because I think that there's a lot that we can gain as a sector by doing so. Thank you very much.
Zach, thanks. That's great. Really, really helpful, really insightful, and you know, I think a really positive distillation of the research as well as some of the leadership lessons, which I'm sure we'll come back to. So, just before I pass over to Nigel to kind of adjudicate the next part, Jane, I just wondered if there's any kind of general reflections you wanted to give from an Arup perspective on the back of Zach's introduction there.
Thank you, Tom. Well, if I briefly introduce myself as well. So for those that don't know me, my name's Jane Healy-Brown, and I'm a director at Arup based in Manchester, so just down the road from Tom. I'm also Planning and Housing Commissioner for Greater Manchester Combined Authority and non-exec director on a housing association. So I see all of this being played out in different ways, or similar ways, should I say, probably across different organisations. And a lot of the work that I'm involved with is supporting the public sector, be it through work directly for local and combined authorities, central government, also through Homes England. And I was fortunate to be involved in the Towns Fund delivery partner work that Zach mentioned as well. And I think we often go back to that because it was unusual that you could be working with 101 authorities that were delivering at the same time. And that work concluded about 12 months ago, probably now. And we could see some of the early stages of this coming to play out, but it has accelerated quite significantly since. And I think one of the things that would be good for us to reflect on in the panel discussion is the project level at which we manage this, but also at the institutional level about the arrangements that we need to put into place as well. And I think there's lots of learning and sharing between, no doubt, the panelists, but no doubt those that have dialed in as well around both those two aspects, so we can pick up on that.
Great, thanks, Jane. Right, Nigel, over to you for the next part and some Q&A.
Great, thanks, Tom. And for anybody that's on the call, please do type your answers into the Q&A, and we'll pick them up. We've obviously given some thought to some of the things we want to talk about, but also very, very keen to make sure we reflect the questions in the audience. But the first one that I had for the panel is, we're facing this quadruple whammy, as Zach's described it, and we know that there's inflationary pressures all over the place. Do you think, actually, in terms of what's going on and some of the announcements the government's made, are we reaching capacity in our ability to deliver capital projects? And to what extent do you think productivity in the industry, as well as changing the dynamic of suppliers and the supply chain and onshoring investment in supply, might make some of the difference to this? Are there any answers in any of that? Don't know who wants to go first. Ray. Zach,
well, I'm happy to give it a shot.
Yeah, well, go for it.
Unless you want to pick one of us off, as it were. But I do think that there is. I do think there's a real question about whether or not capacity has been reached, and I think particularly when you go beyond some of the bigger delivery partners and you look at the SME supply chain in and around construction, the failure rate, the attrition rate, the mental health impacts that are reported, and even I was very alarmed to discover in some stats I was looking at with colleagues the other week, the suicide rate from young male employees of SME contractors in the built environment industry has rocketed over the course of COVID. And I think that there is a real question about resilience, not just in the bigger suppliers, but amongst that SME supply chain as well, that we need to look at, which is part of the capacity question. I do think there is something in the kind of quadrant, even though it was in circles, Zach, that you presented, that talked about how you can try to sort of you know, step outside the melee and think about how your pipeline is constructed, how a commissioner's risk appetite is clarified, and so on, that are important to that. You know, we often say in local government we've got, although there are some fairly kind of bleak things going on in the industry at the moment, we do still have tools at our disposal in relation to access to capital borrowing, in relation to how we gear our pipeline and programs over time, and the certainty that we can perhaps, the greater certainty I should say, that we can perhaps put into supply chains in lieu of that coming from the funding environment that's there nationally. So I think there's lots of leadership stuff to reflect on, but I also think the final thing for me, Nigel, is we as a sector, we need to be brave in talking about those impacts very publicly, and continuing, whether that's through what we do in IED or through there's a great initiative going on in GM at the moment called Save Construction, which is all about, you know, voicing some of these concerns and impacts in the supply chain in a more sort of amplified way. I think as a profession, as a group of professions in the built environment, we need to get very strong about amplifying those impacts, because you know, there's nothing like a consistent message to help to get some change in the macro funding environment that sits around all this as well. So yeah, just a few reflections from me.
Thanks, thanks, Tom. Any additional thoughts, Zach?
Yeah, I think that those are all very real and serious challenges that the sector is facing. I think one of the issues that I hear spoken about the most is, how do we approach that dialogue in a meaningful way without, you know, completely eroding any power that we have in the relationship. So, you know, there's a change in dynamic between local government, contractors, developers, and other private partners that's going to need to change in order for us to really think about sharing risk differently, to think about how we share information and insights, and how we offer certainty in meaningful ways. You know, if we want to de-risk projects so that they're more attractive to private sector lenders or finance, for example, how can we do that without necessarily eroding some of the net zero sustainability requirements? So we're going to have to be a bit better about the way that we communicate the value add of some of those aspects of our projects, but also the way that we can meaningfully de-risk through either the way that we approach contracts, or the way that we share information, or the way that we change our ways of working.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's right. And if I sort of merge the first question from the audience, and thanks for the questions, and do keep them coming in. We've got a couple now. If I sort of merge that same question around capacity and impacts to you, Jane, clearly you work in Manchester, Zach is in London. That capacity question to you too, but also whether you have seen significant variation in inflation on the impact across geographic locations, you know, as a firm. So just sort of reflections on that as well, if you're able.
I will do my best in an anecdotal rather than a scientific way, and I think unfortunately the response rate means that sort of a geographical disaggregation of the data probably isn't possible, unfortunately. I think the geographical variation that I've experienced actually is more related to the underlying geographical variations that we're all very familiar with. And it means that the capacity to respond in places, land values, etc., all become more challenging when we have all of these things playing out. So in other words, there's a north-south divide in terms of how this plays out, but you've got some urban-rural divides as well that come to play with that. So that, I would say, it just exacerbates underlying existing geographical trends from my experience.
And I mean, it strikes me that generally we've had downward value pressure as a result of recessionary pressures across many parts of the industry, whilst at exactly the same time upward cost pressures. So it's not just uncertainty in the industry. I mean, it's viability more generally, I guess. I mean, are there any particular areas, Jane, sort of carrying on that thought, any bits where you see bright lights or green shoots, or however you want to express it, or is it downwards across the piece?
Let's always try and find some positives. I think some of the devolution agreements from government in terms of public sector funding and allowing that to now focus on a more placed base rather than a programme basis will allow the individual challenges of individual places to be better responded to. But I still think we're quite a long way off being able to deliver in that way. I don't think the institutions are set up well to really deliver that, but we are moving in the right direction. So from a green shoots point of view, I would certainly flag that. I do think we still have the underlying challenge of land value and land value capture. And with a planning background, that's something very much that we are very interested in. I was part of Plan Alive event last week, and that was absolutely a hot topic at Plan Alive North last week. An ongoing issue, but I think one that is increasingly being seen higher and higher up the agenda for addressing.
Great, thank you. And I guess maybe the same question to Tom and Zach in a slightly different way around different sectors and geographies. So clearly, Tom, with a knowledge sort of Greater Manchester, Zach, I know a national role, but based in London. I mean, Tom, how do you see the various aspects? Is everything underwater at the moment apart from logistics, or how do you see things?
Well, yeah, no is the short answer, and I think it depends obviously very much on the type of project, and probably more importantly, I think in this environment, the duration of certainty that can be put behind it. So I mean, residential is a good example where residential is still in a pretty strong position in Salford, in particularly central Greater Manchester generally, and that's partly because BTR is still flying off the shelves and shooting out of the ground and so on, because of the longer term certainty that the financial structure behind those kinds of resi schemes can provide. I was interested, not least, despite the sample size on the survey, Zach, in the, if you like, the kind of sectoral breakdown of where those pressures are most being felt, because on the assumption that the property and community infrastructure stuff includes things like leisure developments at a local level, I think those things are much, much harder in the current environment, particularly when you're trying to do a short-term build project that is effectively community infrastructure by another name in areas of land where viability was a challenge in the first place. Even now with inflation and everything else added on, it's all the more so. So we've had our own examples in Salford of having to sacrifice new build leisure projects, or at least put them on ice for an indefinite period of time as a result of that. And that's not doing any favors to what should be a localized leveling up agenda that is, demonstrably on any kind of indices you choose to look at, something that lots of parts of GM, mine included, are in great need of, really. So, I think there are, and logistics continues to do reasonably well is probably an understatement. My experience of that is similar. It's held up similarly well in parts of GM as it did in West Yorkshire, where I was previously. And there are other drivers to that demand, obviously, in the way that the digital and e-economy has boomed in recent times. But I think in the round, when you look at the projections for the duration of the current economic difficulties and for when inflation will turn a corner and so on, it's all the more argument for us to be able to try where we can, particularly where we've got influence over public sector budgets, we've got influence over PWLB borrowing rates, for example, in the public sector, to try and introduce 10, 15 year plus certainty behind particular types of schemes, even if that means we have a different sectoral balance in the short term in order to provide some supply chain certainty in and around the built environment sectors. I think that's a good thing. The challenge I would always come back to, though, Nigel, in any of these discussions, and I say this in conversations with government, said it throughout all of the discussions we've had in GM about devolution deals and levelling up funds and all the rest of it, is that pressure cannot, over the medium to long term, solely be borne by the capital budgets at the disposal of local authorities. The risk has to be shared nationally with government as well. And I think the more we can, over time, move away from, you know, a more micro competition for capital culture to a better single pot, medium to long term settlement agreement that allows the public sector, locally, regionally, nationally, to share risk and introduce greater levels of certainty in areas of significant viability challenge when it comes to land value, all the better. And I think, finishing on a point of optimism on all of this, because I know we're being encouraged into optimism by myself and everybody else, although it didn't necessarily have absolutely everything we would have liked in the latest round of Devo deals for ourselves, for the West Midlands and so on. I think some of the provisions, particularly around the single pot agreement, the single settlement agreement for GMCA, we are starting to see a bit of a recognition of the need for those things in the market on behalf of government. And I think that's a positive step. It's a kind of foot in the door and a bit of a, hopefully a kind of door opener for some further discussions around that greater certainty over the medium term.
Thanks, Tom. And Zach, just to try and maybe move the conversation on a bit, but very good to hear your views, particularly as you've got a panel of people mainly based, well, and exclusively based in the north, apart from yourself. Just your perspectives on whether there are any variations that you see in other regions of the UK. And that's not just about London. I mean, we've got a question here about Torbay and the southwest, and whether we're being too simplistic around talking about north-south divides, which probably we are, but just your reflections on that geography and sector approach that you've seen in conversations recently.
Absolutely. I'm going to start off by rounding that sector approach, because there's some really great survey results that came out from the BCIS as well. They looked at where is the greatest confidence in different sectors by contractors, and at the moment it's strongest in infrastructure. They see a strong pipeline and a lot more certainty around delivery around infrastructure, with actually private sector housing kind of falling behind in confidence. That all being said, it really takes on a very local approach to how different partners are managing risk, the relationships they have with all of their delivery partners. So it is quite a nuanced story. So thinking geographically, so I'm doing some work with a county in the southeast who's actually trying to understand how COVID-19 and cost inflation, all these kind of all the things, Brexit even, we haven't even, I said the B word, I did it, I brought it up, but how all of these things are coming together to affect their office market and their commercial market more broadly. Is there going to be a change in what their office market needs? If so, is the private sector going to deliver it? What is that friction going to be, and what is the timescale that we're talking about? And I think all of these questions are incredibly important. And even in very traditionally affluent, economically successful parts of the country, we're struggling with change at scale and pace. And I think that's where we see a very common theme around the challenges. That's not to say that investor appetite isn't going to continue to be strong there, but it does mean that they are facing new challenges that they might not have before. I also had a really great conversation with Centre for London about this topic as well, and kind of and in London sometimes we can be a bit cocky around we've been growing for 30 years and that's going to continue. But there's the question of, if we're all sitting and waiting to hit go on our projects. We're waiting for inflation to fall that little bit so that we have that bit more confidence. And then we all have to go back to our politicians and our officers and get approvals to then hit go again. And then 6 months has passed. If we all hit go at once, can the market absorb that? And I think that's going to be a really big challenge, where we've seen skills constraints and supplier constraints. If we don't have a bit more of a coordinated and curated response, then you could have some really challenging issues as we head back into delivery. And I guess to respond a bit to the question around Torbay, I'm doing some work in that part of the world as well. I'm not just a London guy, but I think that I completely agree. You know, the leveling up agenda, for whatever name we're going to continue to call it, there are parts of the country, no matter north, south, mids, or devolved administrations that are lagging behind, that face real structural skills challenges and investment challenges, and they often get left behind in the political debate. So I think that there's a real, again, I'm going to just keep sounding like a broken record. I think there's a real need for us to work with our neighbors, to work with our colleagues across different local authorities, to understand how we can solve some of these problems together, because we can't do it all on our own.
Yeah, and it does seem maybe we're going back to that situation where the most cyclical industry in the economy, if we're not careful, is back to being construction, and that doesn't really benefit anybody, does it? I think, Zach, just to carry on, and whilst you're in the hot seat, why not? Just to look at 2 or 3 of the questions that have come in together, and please do keep sending them in. So I hear that infrastructure is an area of confidence at the moment. I suppose I always probably show my age, but think of roads and rail and all the rest of it with infrastructure. But then there's digital too. And actually, and one of our questioners picks this up, that it seems to be the area where the infrastructure was being affected most by this impact. And so it'd be interesting to see whether you had any thoughts on that. And also then there's a couple of questions in the chat about the improving situation from an inflation perspective. And clearly you put a graph up at the beginning about the future. How does the industry see inflation going now in terms of material supply? And in fact, one of our questioners even slightly worrying about interest rates and the potential of the future of negative inflation. So I don't know how you sort of saw that. First of all, digital. Secondly, inflation picture. You're on.
Of course. So on digital, I think part of that is the way that the question was interpreted, and the responsibilities that, in particular, local government parties have in delivering digital. It is largely provided by the private sector. There are ways that the public sector can engage and intervene and support digital infrastructure delivery. But by and large, I think that there is a continued market for digital investment that is being delivered by the private sector. And thus it has felt relatively protected compared to some of our other areas, which might be facing a bit more acute pressures. Oftentimes the bill for these projects also tends to be smaller than, let's say, delivering social housing or major community infrastructure. So then it might be that they don't face challenges in the same way. The second part of your question around kind of the longer term, how do we deal with the fact that we might reach negative inflation? If I had that answer, I might be a slightly richer man. But I do think that there's a real challenge now that, because we are trying to continue to deliver at uncertain times, we're kind of I'm going to use the phrase pepper picking, but I think I'm making that up now. We'll say it's American. We're just kind of like pepper picking, like little bits and pieces of projects that we can get through the door and get delivered and to keep everything rolling. But we're losing sight of that golden thread and that original strategy of what we're trying to achieve. And what I would say is, no matter where we are in the economic cycle, making sure that we go back to our original plan and understand the rationale for why we're investing in these things, and then how we need to adapt going forward. That's the most important thing. So if we're staying true to our vision of what we want to achieve for our communities and for our businesses and for our places and pride of place, then ultimately we should be able to navigate those whatever the economic circumstances may be. That's a bit of a cheat answer because I don't have I don't have a crystal ball, but that's my response.
I'd say it was fair enough. I'm not sure any of us know how to deal with negative inflation, and I think in an economy where the aging population seems to be also likely to create challenges, I wonder whether we really will get to a situation of negative inflation. But Tom, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, and just quickly to come in, I mean, I wouldn't equally, I would share Zach's lack of a crystal ball on negative inflation for sure, but I just wanted to add, I suppose, a thought on, when it's actually, given you've mentioned it, Nigel, on the demographic point, I think there is also a longer term development certainty that can be almost kind of tied to and correlated with that supply chain certainty challenge. If you're thinking about things like how we're trying to develop extra care housing schemes for an aging population in Greater Manchester, for instance, those kind of projects, I'm not quite sure which category of the survey they would necessarily fall into, but I think there's partly a bit of a debate there. The point I was just quickly going to make as well, though, was I do think there's part of a debate here about how in leadership and supply chain influencing roles, we need to support the industry, particularly around materials, in terms of its own evolution into different ways of working. And this is particularly on the net zero point. So one of the things I learned a lot about, which I didn't know a lot about until I sat down with Jane actually at a MIPIM event, was the volume of recycled material that went into doing the Mayfield depot scheme in Manchester. Know the project well, but didn't know the specifics of it at all. And I was interested that my professional body, for what it's worth, RICS, put out quite a worrying report. I think it was this morning actually, or last night, which was all to do with the bounce back in the wrong way on net zero in construction, as parts of the construction sector have started in the short term to rebound. And part of their argument in that was actually there needs to be a change of mindset, an evolution of skills, of product, of project management, and so on around reuse and recycling, particularly in construction. And I think when you tie all of that to what we're trying to do on skills devolution and how that applies within all of the sectors around the built environment, I know this is a thing that's close to Arup's heart as well in a big way for all the right reasons. That sense of, is this just about supply of new materials, or is it about retrofit, recycle, reuse within all of the sectors we're talking about, I think also offers potentially some forks in the road for a different future around all of this. So I think, the RICS thing was quite an interesting read in that respect. And but yeah, food for thought in terms of the role of recycling in construction as well, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And yeah, I can see Jane wants to reflect on that same conversation maybe that you had at MIPIM.
Well, I'm not going to repeat our session on concreting, and I'll save that for another day. But I just wanted to build on the net zero point. And I also think it is a slightly parallel point to the question in the chat around how digital infrastructure was responded to in the survey. That what really struck me is looking at the questions around what participants were most concerned about. Affordability, reputational risk were at the top, redesign was somewhere in the middle, and net zero was seen as much lower. And I think I found that really quite concerning, because it did play out some of the things that I'm experiencing on a project level, where net zero is often seen as a financial accounting solution to some of those other problems by delaying net zero interventions. And delaying net zero clearly is not a net zero solution, but it's how it's then being included in development programs and financial plans as a solution to what are seen as the higher risks around affordability and reputational risk. And so what this is meaning in what we're actually now seeing is development programs are seeing net zero coming further down the line, or for example, in some of the work doing with housing providers, both social housing and developers as well, is that those programs mean that the delivery, particularly of affordable housing, is being delayed, but the delivery of new net zero homes is also being delayed, and the retrofit of some homes is going to be delayed as well. So I think we just need to understand actually what that is, what the survey results are telling us about net zero, and challenge ourselves. Actually, are we seeing it as too easy a solution to change our programs to address what we see as the bigger and more important risks? And is that really the right thing for us to be doing?
And I think it is alarming, and post Ukraine, the pressure on delaying, the change in the energy mix, the change in projects, you know, all of this sort of heading in the wrong direction, I guess. So we'll probably, unless we get more questions in the chat, I certainly want to pick up one thing, and maybe this will be the last thing, but it's a pretty big issue at the moment. So we've talked a lot about government spend. We've talked a lot about the role of local government and the certainty it can bring. I think we're seeing quite a lot of interest now from institutional investment. Maybe it's always been there. Maybe it's just a bit more prominent at the moment, but maybe the amount of institutional funding that's around, maybe taking a longer term view on value, taking a slightly lower view on returns, willing to take a longer term position overall on projects. Do you think this is different? Do you think this is likely to create a major shift, or is this just what it always was, which is at the margins, the private sector has a role to play in difficult regeneration projects? And I just don't know what people's views are on that. I don't know who wants to go first, but Tom, you're off mute, so maybe go with you first.
Yeah, I think it's not, and it won't be, we shouldn't pretend it's the only panacea, but I think when you combine an increased appetite for CSR within the industry, and particularly for shareholder demand on CSR, that does potentially change the rules of the game. I think if you couple that, as importantly, with a very increased, a much more visible expectation around the delivery of social value through public procurement. I mean, we've just done a great big Greater Manchester piece of work on that was reported at our combined authority a week or so ago. Salford and Manchester, amongst others in GM, are well known for pursuing frankly, a much harder line on social value through our public procurement, whether that's in relation to supply chain, jobs, environmental considerations, social infrastructure, and more besides. I think working with industry, public commissioners can get a greater result for that. And I suppose the bit of hope in it for me, Nigel, is even though you might not change that at scale, and none of us who've worked in and around the property industry would try and, approach a residential appraisal, for example, expecting there wouldn't be a margin consideration in it in the long run. I think if there are degrees of change within those appraisals can produce a very significant result to SME supply chain stability and margins to play with in that respect, which can help the industry at large. So, I know politically that's obviously a very different conversation, quite rightly too, for a different day and a separate event. But I think when you're working with degrees of change at the margins, that can have a more significant effect within some of the sectors and some of the size and scale of firm that we're talking about. So I think there's all to play for in that regard, I would suggest.
Great, yeah, that's useful. Jane, anything to add to those comments of Tom's?
I don't think so, really. I suppose the only thing I would say is I agree with CSR, the ESG agenda. We hear more about that from the private sector. Interestingly, I think it's talked about different language in different places. The ESG terminology is much stronger in London because it's where the HQs tend to be, where they're having to report on that. I think in Greater Manchester and other northern cities, you're having more headquarters where they're having to deal with this. So you're starting to hear it termed more using ESG as a language. Other than that, I think it's played out through net zero and social value requirements. What I do think is interesting is the positive of that ESG agenda for delivering on the net zero side, but often the corporate driven ESG angle has much more the focus on the environmental and less on the social. And so I think it's with us all to make sure if we see that coming to the fore is to encourage it, but ensure it has got that balance across all the aspects.
Yeah, thank you.
Nigel, I think there's probably a whole separate webinar. Here's a thought on the net zero side.
Yes.
I completely agree with Jane, and it links actually to, I know it's probably coming a bit too late, but one of the latest questions that I just pressed the like thing on about, you know, how much more could government actually incentivize net zero delivery in that regard, I think is spot on. And there's another, definitely another debate there.
Yeah, and I'd agree, and absolutely. Even when you look at things like carbon pricing to feed into Green Book appraisals, it doesn't really push us down particularly low carbon routes. But that's probably a bit of a geeky answer. Zach, any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think kind of ending it on a bit of positive note as well. I would just say what we're trying to do on some of our projects is really flip that. So institutional investment is great, and to see that to continue to grow is excellent. And you know, if that can be one of the products that comes out of this uncertainty, then that's brilliant. But we're trying to look at how do you look at sustainability, social value, and net zero is not things that necessarily cost you more, but that can also be value generators. So we did an economic and social impact study for a major cultural and education venue, where we took a social value approach that informed the design, which then had very practical benefits in that it might have reduced the time and the challenges to planning permission because the design was better. It's meeting the community needs. It is generating social value through design because they've approached it that way. So it makes it easier and less costly to go through that process. But ultimately, it's also creating more value for tenants. It might reduce vacancy rates or increase take-up speed or even increase rents. So I think, you know, oftentimes it's easier to look at some of these as costs on the balance sheet rather than actually bigger opportunities for value generation. So I think that is one of the key benefits of something that might come out of these times.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, you know, for a topic that could have been quite doom and gloom, I think actually everybody on the panel has seen some glimmers of hope in all of this, and the value that can be achieved by building some of the things in that we've been talking about. So yeah, thanks, Zach. I mean, I think we've given a good air into the questions, and it's been a good discussion, which certainly I've enjoyed. I just was going to pass over to Tom to close things out.
Yep. No, thanks, Nigel. I can see some colleagues have had to drop off now, and I think a few of us have probably got to do the same. So we'll wrap up there. The good thing about these events is partly when you can see, I think that optimism, Nigel, you're right, to finish with that is a good reminder that we're all in this for the long run. Actually, we're not just here to kind of bemoan today's problems. We're here to try and do a bit of forecasting and thinking about how we can improve that environment in the future. So I think the Arup work has been a really positive contribution to that, and I hope we can do more of it. I hope colleagues on the call as well, when we come to commission the next survey on this, will also help us to, I suppose, boost and broaden the response rate, because the more data we've got to work with as a partnership and the more of that cross-sectoral voice that we hoover up as IED, I think the better our arguments will be supported in the long run. So Massive thanks to Zach for the detailed work behind it and the presentation. So I'm really appreciative of that, and obviously to Jane for some brilliant contributions. You know, we value that partnership between IED and Arup in a big way. I hope colleagues on the call who want to take an interest in membership will do so. Can't resist another plug on that front, but please do engage with Save Construction and other things, because the campaigning point a few of us made, I think, is really important. Thank you all for the Q&A, to Nigel as well for curating the middle part of the session. I hope you enjoyed it. Send us some feedback. It'd be great to hear from you all, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. All right, great to see you. Bye now.